In this video lesson, we'll discuss popular sovereignty and the Underground Railroad. Each of the two great political parties was a vital bond of national unity, for each enjoyed powerful support in both the North and the South. To politicians, the wisest strategy seemed to be to sit on the lid of the slavery issue and ignore it. Anxious Democrats were forced to seek a new standard-bearer in 1848. President Polk, broken in health by overwork, had pledged himself to only a single term as president. The Democratic National Convention at Baltimore turned to an aging leader, General Lewis Cass, a veteran of the War of 1812. Although a senator and diplomat, he was very pompous, silent about the issue of slavery in the territories as well. Although the Democratic Party was silent, Cass was not silent. His views on the extension of slavery were well known because he was a reputed father of popular sovereignty, a doctrine that stated that the principles of the Constitution should themselves determine the status of slavery in the separate state. Popular sovereignty meant that it was the voters in a territory that should vote to decide whether a state would be free or slave. Popular sovereignty had persuasive appeal. The public liked it because it accorded with the democratic tradition of self-determination. People could decide if the state that they were in was going to be free or slave themselves. Politicians liked it because it seemed a compromise between the abolitionist bid for a ban on slavery in the territories and Southern demands that Congress would protect slavery in the territories. Popular sovereignty tossed the slavery problem into the laps of the people of the various territories. Advocates for the principle thus hoped to dissolve the most stubborn national issue of the day into a series of local issues that could be spread out. Popular sovereignty had one fatal defect: it might serve to spread the blight of slavery. The Whigs, meeting in Philadelphia, cashed in on Taylor fever. They nominated Zachary Taylor, the hero of Buena Vista, who had never held civil office or even voted for president. Henry Clay should logically have been nominated, but Clay had made too many speeches and too many enemies. The Whigs were eager to win at any cost. They dodged issues and merely extolled homespun virtues of their candidate. This frontier fighter had not committed himself on the issue of slavery extension, but he did own slaves on his sugar plantation. Ardent anti-slavery men in the North, distrusting both Cass and Taylor, organized the Free Soil Party. Aroused by the conspiracy of silence in the Democratic and Whig platforms, the Free Soilers came out for the Wilmot Proviso and were against slavery in the territories. Going beyond other anti-slavery groups, they broadened appeal by advocating federal aid for internal improvements and urging free government homesteads for settlers. The new party attracted industrialists miffed at Polk's reduction of protective tariffs. It appealed to Democrats resentful of Polk's setting for a part of Oregon, while insisting on all of Texas, a disparity that suggested a menacing Southern dominance among Democrats. It harbored many Northerners whose hatred was directed not so much at slavery, but at African Americans who gagged at the prospect of sharing the newly acquired Western territories with them. It also contained a large element of conscious Whigs, heavily influenced by the abolitionist crusade who condemned slavery. The Free Soilers trotted out wizened former President Van Buren and marched into the fray shouting free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Free Soilers condemned slavery not so much for enslaving African Americans, but for destroying the chances of free white workers to rise up from wage-earning dependence to the esteemed status of self-employment, which could only be accomplished if they owned their own soil. As the first inclusive party organized around the issue of slavery and confined to a single section, the Free Soil Party foreshadowed the emergence of the Republican Party. With the slavery issue officially shoved under the rug by the two major parties, the politicians on both sides opened fire on personalities. The amateurish Taylor had to be carefully watched, lest his pen puncture the reputation won by his sword. His admirers puffed him up as a gallant knight and sloganized his remark, "General Taylor never surrenders." Taylor's wartime popularity pulled him through, and Free Soiler Van Buren diverted enough Democratic strength from Cass in New York to throw the election to General Zachary Taylor. President Taylor was a military square peg in a political round hole. He would have been spared if he had continued to sit on the lid of the expansion controversy, but the discovery of gold in California early in the year of 1848 blew the cover off. A horde of adventurers poured into the valleys of California singing "O Susanna" and shouting "Gold, gold, gold," and began tearing at the yellow gravel streams and hills. A fortunate few of the bearded miners struck it gold, or struck it rich, at the diggings. But the luckless man probably would have been better off if they had stayed at home, unaffected by gold fever, which was often followed by more deadly fevers. The most reliable profits were made by those who mined the miners, notably by charging outrageous rates for laundry and other personal services. The overnight pouring of tens of thousands of people into the future Golden State completely overwhelmed the one-horse government of California. A distressingly high proportion of the newcomers were lawless men, accompanied by virtueless women. An outburst of crime inevitably resulted from the presence of so many miscreants and outcasts. Robbery, claim jumping, and murder were commonplace, and such violence was only partly discouraged by rough vigilante justice. A majority of Californians, as decent and law-abiding as citizens needing protection, grappled earnestly with the problem of erecting adequate state government. Privately encouraged by President Taylor, they drafted a constitution in 1849 that excluded slavery, making it a free state, and then boldly applied to Congress for admission. California would thus bypass the usual territorial stage, thwarting Southern congressmen seeking to block free soil. Southern politicians arose in opposition. Would California prove to be the golden straw that broke the back of the Union? The South of 1850 was relatively well off. It enjoyed more than its share of the nation's leadership, and it had seated the war hero Zachary Taylor from Louisiana. It boasted a majority of the cabinet and on the Supreme Court. If outnumbered in the House, the South definitely had equality in the Senate, where it could at least neutralize issues. Its cotton fields were expanding, and cotton prices were profitably high. Few people believed that slavery was seriously threatened, where it existed below the Mason-Dixon line. 15 slave states could veto any constitutional amendment against it. Yet the South was deeply worried, as it had been for several decades, by the ever-tipping political balance. There were then 15 slave states and 15 free states. The admission of California would destroy the delicate equilibrium in the Senate, perhaps forever. Potential slave territory was short if it had not in fact disappeared. Agitation had already developed in the territories of New Mexico and Utah for admission as non-slave states. The fate of California might well set a precedent for the rest of the Mexican Cession territory. Texas claimed a huge area east of the Rio Grande and north to the 42nd parallel, embracing in part about half the territory of present-day New Mexico. The federal government was proposing to detach this prize, while Texans were threatening to descend upon Santa Fe and seize what they regarded as rightfully theirs. Many Southerners were also angered by the nagging agitation in the North for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, with the prospect of more free soil in between. Even more disagreeable to the South was the loss of runaway slaves, many of whom were being assisted north by the Underground Railroad. This was a virtual freedom train that consisted of an informal chain of stations through which scores of runaway slaves were spirited by conductors. usually white and black abolitionists from the slave states to free soil of Canada. The most amazing of these conductors was an illiterate runaway slave from Maryland, fearless Harriet Tubman. During 19 forays into the South, she rescued more than 300 slaves and deservedly earned the title of Moses. By 1850, Southerners were demanding a new and more stringent fugitive slave law. The old one passed Congress in 1893 had proved inadequate to cope with runaways, especially since unfriendly state authorities failed to provide necessary cooperation. The abolitionists who ran the Underground Railroad did not gain personally from their lawlessness, but to the slave owners, the loss was infuriating, whatever the motive. Estimates indicate that the South in 1850 was losing perhaps 1,000 runaways a year out of its some 4 million slaves. In fact, more African Americans probably gained their freedom by self-purchase or voluntary emancipation than ever escaped. But the slave masters rested their argument on the Constitution, which protected slavery, and on the laws of Congress, who provided for slave catching. We'll discuss more about the Underground Railroad and the impact on the tension between the North and South in our daily lessons.